So many countries, so little time. My life at Spangdahlem Air Base, Germany, was fated to be tumultuous from the day I landed. My soon-to-be ex-husband thought that my PCS from Andersen Air Base, Guam to Germany meant that I was going to give this marriage a go, when I had already decided it was over after just a few weeks in Guam. I was honest with him, as you have already read, and I admit that I did give him false hope, only to ensure that my belongings were not scattered to the four winds or set on fire before I had even arrived. My mother had always taught me to prepare for the worst, and a broken heart tends to bring out the worst in people. Lucas picked me up from the airport in an older BMW and took me to our house in a small town that I have long forgotten the name of. It could have been Metternich. For whatever reason, that name sparked some familiarity. The house was one story. However, I remembered that the garage was underneath and that to mow the lawn, you had to go below. You also had to remember that you couldn't mow on Sundays. It also had an attic, which I remember vividly, as from day one I began hiding away anything that I wanted to take with me when I was finally able to move out on my own. I didn't put much in the attic, but I do remember hiding a new set of silverware and a few other household items. Again, I was always planning. I had to figure that when the time came, Lucas would only let me take what was officially mine, and anything else he would battle over, if not just to prolong the inevitable. I had gone through this once before, and I had to give up half the money in my savings and only left with my clothing and a few personal items to avoid further confrontation. I'm still amazed at how most women seem to get everything, but I'm too set on being fair. The bottom line, the house was beautiful and rustic. If I had been older and more aware, I probably would have realized this was one of the most beautiful places I had ever lived. I remember on occasion, Lucas and I would go for walks on the outskirts of town, which was surrounded by forest. The air was crisp and clean, and there was no one else around. You could walk for hours at the edge of this town and never see a soul. As much as I adored this house, I never felt like it was mine. I went to work, and I spent my days in the house doing what everyone does, but I don't remember enjoying time spent in the house. My Precious Moments figurines lined the walls, and the grandfather clock from Florida sat in the corner. But it was like I was just always waiting, like a mouse that knows that it just isn't safe. I was ready to scurry away at the first chance I got. It took a while for Lucas to finally understand what was coming. The first push came when I was taking a bath. The bathroom was all white and the door opened at your back. I was over my head with wonder at the concept of the bidet. However, I never could bring myself to it. One lazy weekend, I decided to take a nice bubble bath. I sat in there and stared at the translucent suds creeping up to my chin like an ever-growing snowdrift, and I wondered how this same situation would have come across to my younger and smaller self. What was I thinking all those years ago, surrounded by what must have seemed like a monstrous landscape of billowy white foam? As my mind drifted, my subconscious brought me back to reality, and I realized I had the strangest feeling that someone was watching me. I yanked my head around just in time to see Lucas peeking into the bathroom between the smallest of cracks in the open door behind me. I felt completely disgusted. I jumped out of the bathtub, grabbed a towel, and slammed the door shut, locking it. I don't know if I even realized he was home. This began the strange and unnerving portion of my life in this house with him. Even after many conversations reiterating the fact that I did not have feelings for him, he would still find ways to creep nearer to me when I let my guard down. At one point, I tried to set him up with someone from a club we went to, and unfortunately, she was not interested. I asked that he keep his distance from me while we worked out the details of my departure, and yet I would wake up in the middle of the night to find him peering in at me from the large window next to the bed. Finally, the straw that broke the camel's back came to pass when I was awoken in the morning by his presence. I went to lift my head from my pillow, and my long hair was stuck beneath his body. Thanks to my past, my first reaction to feeling like someone was pulling my hair was to throw an elbow to his face, which knocked his glasses off and left them broken on the floor. It took a good 1 to 2 minutes of time lapse before he sent me flying off the bed from a kick to the middle of my back. After that, all is history. I went to work, and I informed my supervisor of what had occurred. The master sergeant was very sympathetic, as she had also been a victim of spousal abuse, and she supported me in finding a new apartment. I gathered my things, and I left. Anything I left behind, I had to figure would now be his, or would be something that I had to fight for. Why was I always fighting? I filed divorce papers from Germany and had to wait 1 year before it was finalized. Since we didn't own property or have children, it was very easy. There was a matter of some art that he managed to force me to pay him for just because it meant so much to me. But to this day, I have it hanging in my bedroom. A reminder of the beauty and dreaminess of a past life. Something that I don't associate with my time with him. More of my time becoming who I am today. I let him have the magnificent painting from Bali. I had one of my own sent to my sister Katie years ago, and it still hangs in her house. The art I paid $200 for was not even a painting. They were reproduction prints of the pre-Raphaelite era. The Storm by Cott, The Accolade by Edward Blair Lytton, and Lamia and the Soldier by John William Waterhouse. They reminded me of the magic that still exists in the world. Not the magic of childhood, Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy, Santa, but the magic that still exists even as we age. Love and beauty that withstands all time. The stuff fairy tales are made of, that we all want to have as part of our world. It was worth $200, even if it was just paper in a frame. Off I go to an apartment all on my own in the quaint little town of Gransdorf, Germany. I lived on the second floor. The large kitchen window overlooked the rolling hills of the town. It was beautiful. Little by little, I made my life here. Unfortunately, we understood so little about each other's small cultural differences because certain nuances matter. The Germans are very particular about the cleanliness of their streets. Maybe they don't have street sweepers, and they're huge on recycling. Where I was at this stage of my life, I didn't put a priority on either, and now today I see why it was so important. My friends would often come over and smoke. I was never a smoker, and they would toss their cigarette butts out the kitchen window or directly onto the street below. This drove my landlady, Gisela, crazy, and she pointed out to me several times that it was unacceptable. I would get after my friends, and they would be stubborn and just wouldn't change their ways. Towards the end of my time in Germany, I would find out the hard way what it meant to tick off the entire population of the town you lived in. I was about 8 months pregnant with my daughter Mackenzie, and some local teenagers decided to put a screwdriver into not one, but two of my tires on my brand new 2002 Honda Civic. This was the first brand new vehicle that I had ever purchased. I was beyond livid and had to buy 2 used tires just to be able to get the car ready to be transported back to the States. I'm betting that the kids were sons to some of the people that we bothered while living in the apartment. I don't know that it was entirely undeserved. We were a rowdy bunch. After I moved out of the house I shared with my ex-husband and into my new apartment, I met my third and last husband. I was stumbling back to my girlfriend Miranda's dorm after a night out at the base club. I had gone to tech school with her, although she was in flight medicine and not the bio class. I heard the distant sounds of music, and I veered in the direction, not even thinking about it. I glided up the stairs and onto the second story of the dorms and into his room. After the fact, I found out they were celebrating his soon-to-be 21st birthday. I didn't care. I just wanted to be where the music was. I wandered the room, and someone poured me a cup of jungle juice, a mixture of various alcohols, juices, and gummy bears. I managed to spill the red juice right down the front of my white bandana-style shirt. And Michael, a friend of Jackson's, took me to the bathroom sink. After he left, I pulled off my shirt to wash it clean, wrung it out, and tied it back on. I went back out to the room and sat on Jackson's bed, which was being used as another sitting area during the party. Jackson had posters of scantily clad women all over his room. It was like he took a magazine and just pinned all the photos up onto his wall. I looked at the photos and had very minimal conversations with the people in the room, and then at some point, I left to get back to my girlfriend's room. I don't remember if someone walked me there or if I managed to get there in my sleepwalking trance, but I woke up in the morning as if nothing had even transpired over the course of the night. A few weeks later, I went to a club in Trier, Germany with some friends and bumped into Jackson. I thought it was funny because he was wearing a long-sleeved cream-color round collar sweater reminiscent of the TV show Friends, and he said to me as I passed, "You're the girl that crashed my birthday party." I laughed and asked him to remind me of the occasion, and once it sparked my memory, I laughed again. At the time, Jackson thought I was a local German girl because I guess I didn't speak much while I was there. Tequila will do that to a person's communicatory skills. The whole thing was comical. I had just been out on the dance floor with a guy who was not quite my height and also much smaller than me, and we looked like we were swing dancing. I don't know how to swing dance, and I don't know how he lifted me. Maybe in another life, I not only did clog dance, but was also a world-renowned swing dancer. People were dancing and drinking all around us, and the air was full of energy. No one cared about what was in their future, and everyone just wanted to live for the night. These were all of the nights in Germany. I don't think I started to think of the future until I became pregnant with Mackenzie. There would be more clubs and more parties before I finally fell in for good with Jackson and his crew. On this particular night, I recall that a young guy named JJ caught my eye. JJ was a tall, thin, exotic-looking boy with wavy dark hair and full lips. His eyes were deep brown, and they were always mischievous. He's the reason we didn't name our son Jackson Jr. When JJ came into the room, everyone noticed him, or at least it felt that way to me. He was funny and lighthearted, and he did not have a care in the world, which was probably why he was caught doing drugs and ended up getting kicked out of the Air Force. I didn't always have a keen eye when it came to choosing companions that were good for me or my future, but then I guess this statement would be more accurate if I said I rarely had a keen eye for this. I didn't spend much time with JJ, however, I do remember that once he came over and we slow danced in my living room. It all sounds very basic. Lucas stopped by, not unannounced, to drop off a few personal belongings, and when he started knocking on the door, JJ froze. JJ and Lucas were friends. JJ's eyes got to be the size of golf balls, and he stared at me like a rabbit trapped in a snare. I laughed very quietly and told him he had nothing to worry about. Lucas would leave in a minute, we just had to wait him out. Lucas started to bang on the door and yelled that he knew I was in there, and after a good 10 minutes, he left. I couldn't stop laughing, and JJ grabbed his things and made his exit. I guess his friendship with Lucas was important to him. I never really thought much about it. Eventually, I had to meet up with Lucas to get my stuff, and I invited him over to drop it off again. He came into my apartment and sat on the couch. We talked about so many things we didn't know about each other. How before we had known each other, he had had relations with a girl that I used to hang out with, and I was surprised that it never even crossed my mind. The girl was a little flirty, but to be honest, she was very respectful, and I liked her quite a bit. I think we may have even hugged when he left. I was glad he was gone. We just weren't meant to be together. Oh, the wonderful sights and experiences to be had in Germany and all of Europe. Being stationed in Germany was like being on a 3-year vacation. You worked during the week, not very hard, I might add, and on the weekends you traveled, or you drank at the local bars and clubs. In the beginning, I went on some amazing tours of Italy, Venice, Verona, and Florence, Bavaria, Switzerland, Austria, Liechtenstein, Prague, England, London, and Poland. Auschwitz was the highlight of the destination. We drove all over France, Paris, Versailles, Verdun, Belgium, Netherlands, Amsterdam, Luxembourg. This was a location we drove to often. And Germany, Berlin, the Black Forest, Trier, the Rhine, Manderscheid Castle, Cochem Castle, Neuschwanstein Castle, Heidelberg, Kulm, Wittlich Pig Fest, Rock'em Ring at the Nürburgring Ring racetrack. I'm probably missing some places. Every place had its feel and effect on you as you drove through the streets, walked through the towns, ate the food, and experienced the world around you. I think I could have lived my entire life in Europe, just traveling to the various cities and towns and digesting every aspect they had to offer. Sure, there were strange things that I would find that I didn't understand. You had to pay via a coin slot to even open the bathroom door in Kulm, but none of it made me want to do anything differently. The people were generally agreeable, and if they weren't, it honestly was probably since Americans can come off as pretentious at times. If I had to do it all over again, I would drink less and travel more. I planned to bring my children here as my daughter's graduation gift, and in a way to retrace all the places that I saw. This fell through when COVID reared its ugly head in early 2020 and caused a domino effect, ending in pretty intense travel restrictions. We'll get there, and thanks to the tour guides doing such a wonderful job highlighting the locations that we went to, I'm hoping that if I do my homework, I can be just as informative and eye-opening as they were for me when we finally make it back there. Jackson and I met for the 3rd time on one of my outings. A friend, Benjamin, invited me to go to Rock'em Ring at the Nürburgring racetrack in June 2001. Rock'em Ring is a music festival held annually that's typically held the first weekend of June. The bands playing that year were Tool, Papa Roach, Anastasia, Limp Bizkit, Kid Rock, and Linkin Park. I went to the festival with Ben. I came home with Jackson. I kind of imagine that Rock'em Ring is a toned-down version of Woodstock. I watched a documentary on Woodstock just a few months back, and it's pretty similar. People brought tents and campers, and it was just a constant flow of individuals, mainly teenagers to middle-aged adults, wandering through the area while listening to the music. The area was evocative of a flat open field that had paths and a large open dirt area worn from traffic, both foot and vehicular. And the weather was cold and rainy. We all ended up getting sick when it was all said and done. I don't know if I changed out of my sweater and jeans the entire weekend, and I also can't recall whose sweater I even ended up with. My bet is on Jackson. We went for 2 days without a shower, and I highly doubt anyone but Jackson used wet wipes. Yep, he at least came prepared. I can't say that I even remember if they had toilets. I'm sure they did, but we just went off and found a spot where nature called, and then kept right along with our business. At one point, I bumped into my soon-to-be close friend Shannon. We became two peas in a pod. She dated Tony, Jackson's best friend, and I dated Jackson. Shannon went to Rock am Ring with her friend Jackie. Shannon and Jackie had their tent, and I didn't really see them much. But strangely enough, this trip bonded Shannon and me. I think weirdly, it was an induction to their group when I made it official that I was with Jackson. Shannon could be a very suspicious and protective girl, and the fact that I was allowed in to be considered part of their group must have meant that Jackson put his neck out for me. Jackson was pretty much the alpha of this group. He had Michael cleaning his room before Shannon and I took over as the moms of the group. Everyone went to see Jackson when they needed advice or when the day was done and it was time to let loose. Tony and Jackson had adjoining rooms, and they used one of their rooms as the party room. There would always be about 6 to 10 people meandering through, watching TV, playing video games, or just drinking and hanging out. This was the closest group of friends I had ever had. Back to Rock am Ring. I always remember vividly being in the middle of the crowd while Anastasia was singing, or maybe it was Linkin Park, and I noticed a pregnant girl in front of me. She was young, short, with straight brown hair, but she was ready to pop. Once I noticed her belly, I started to put my arms in a circle around her. People were smashing in, and I was afraid they would crush her. So I took all the strength that I could, and I growled like a vicious dog for the people to give her some space. The funniest part about it, she turned to me with her sweet little cherubic face, and she just smiled. The smallest and yet most innocent smile. Like, she knew that I was there and that fate had brought me to that specific point at that exact time to ensure her and her baby's safety. Now, future me would have been completely shocked and confused as to how any pregnant female could ever come to find themselves in a crowd full of pulsing, squeezing humans. But future me didn't exist yet. And right then, I was just happy to be doing something that seemed important at the time. After I became part of Jackson's tribe, my traveling slowed down a bit by the increase in social events. It seemed like people were always coming and going, and eventually Jackson moved out of his dorm and moved into an apartment around the corner from mine in Grandstorf. We always thought it was funny because, much like his and Tony's setup, my house became the official dwelling location and his house became the party house. The previous owner was supposedly the town drunk, who was also at some point the town mayor. We would see him wandering the streets at night, and he looked to be inebriated. But he was always friendly, and minus the smell, he was harmless. I don't know how exactly, but we had information that before he started to live in the apartment, they had to clean it out completely. The bed had a hole cut in the middle of it, which was purportedly being used as a toilet. I don't know how much truth was in that, but it made for interesting storytelling. At one point, I thought I was helping by sweeping the sidewalk outside of the apartment. However, I learned quickly that you didn't just sweep the sidewalk into the street. No street sweepers, remember? If someone could have given me the evil eye, then they would have. Most of the time I was just ignorant of the culture or the general way of doing things. It wasn't that I didn't want to learn, eventually. It was more of that pompous American attitude. If this is how we do it at home, then obviously this is how they do it everywhere. As you've read, I come from a small town. No one taught world perspectives, or even that there was a world outside of Bangor, Michigan. The closest we got to that was our history class. The funny thing is that a class containing a world perspective was required for my college degree in environmental management. By then, it was a little late for the topic, considering I had personal exposure to the outside world. Regardless, I carried on in Grandstorf, mainly being unaware of how arrogant I looked or how annoying I was. Speaking of unaware, on September 11, 2001, I was walking down the long hallway on the second floor of the medical group facility. I was a 23-year-old senior airman, had been married twice, and I was still mildly oblivious to the world around me. To be honest, to this day, I can be a bit naive and clueless about what's happening more than 5 feet away from me unless my kids are involved. So here I am, calmly meandering past our small break room, and I see that several of my coworkers are standing in front of the cathode ray television, CRT, that we kept in there for various purposes. I popped my head in and asked, "What movie are you guys watching?" One of the older airmen turned to me with a look of utter disbelief and responded, "This isn't a movie. The Twin Towers have just been hit in a terror attack." I just stood there, not knowing what that meant or how to even process it. I watched as these massive buildings collapsed in a cloud of gray dust, and slowly everything seemed to be coming together. There were people in those buildings, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, friends, people who would no longer come home to their families and tell them about their day. That would have been sheer horror as this was happening right then to them. How could this happen? We're the United States of America. Who would do this to us, and why? The September 11th attacks, commonly known as 9/11, were 4 coordinated Islamist terrorist suicide attacks carried out by al-Qaeda against the United States in 2001. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners, crashing the first 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, and a third into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense in Arlington County, Virginia. The 4th plane crashed in rural Pennsylvania during a passenger revolt. The September 11th attacks killed 2,977 people, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in history. In response to the attacks, the United States waged the multi-decade global war on terror to eliminate hostile groups deemed terrorist organizations, as well as the foreign governments purported to support them. I didn't know anyone directly who was killed. However, the devastation felt by our entire nation, regardless of who the fatalities were, was all-encompassing. There have been a lot of times in the past, and there will be in the future, that we as a nation are divided, but this would not be one of them. After 2001, America began to refocus on a lot of aspects, and we were now aware that we weren't immune to seeing battles fought on our own soil, even after the Civil War, which ended in 1865. In 2011, Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader in Pakistan, was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs. For now, while we stood by waiting to see what would happen next, our lives continued. Our little town of Gransdorf was beautiful. I would go for walks in the town from the bottom of the hill where we lived to the top, which was complete with a large field of grazing cows. In the summer, we would wander and wake to the smell of the local bread and pastry truck, and in the winter, the boys would play on the snow-covered hill behind the apartment. They would find something to sled down the hill with and take turns running back up to the top next to the local church. At one point, I even decided to get 2 bunnies, Baby and Honey, even after I knew that I wasn't supposed to have animals in the apartment. Entitled much? The bunnies were pretty harmless. However, I don't blame Gisela for keeping the $600 rental down payment. They chewed up the bottom of the walls in the kitchen, where they were allowed to run free. At one point, I took the bunnies out to the small park in the town and let them out of their cage to play in the grass. I'm surprised they didn't run off. But for the most part, they were pretty timid and tame, and they stayed near me. It was through a mutual friend of Jackson's that I first met Julie, a German girl with a great sense of humor and a down-to-earth personality. Julie was dating our friend Lucky. His nickname, Lucky, was earned from his impressive ability to avoid any lasting consequences from his reckless one-night stands, like, say, catching an STD. Just so we're clear, Julie was not a one-night stand, nor would she have been any of his past dalliances that could have been carrying an infection present to leave with him. From the moment I met her, Jackson kept pushing me to become friends with her. If you know anything about me, you'd know I tend to resist doing what people expect, as long as it doesn't break any major rules. So naturally, I fought the idea of being her friend. Why would I want to befriend this perfect blonde bombshell of a female that was not only beautiful, but was also intelligent, hilarious, and seemed to want to be my friend? Lucky rented an apartment near mine, and we started visiting him more often. Julie was usually around, always cleaning, cooking, and making sure the place felt welcoming. After months of being stubborn, I finally gave in. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all. We began spending more time together, shopping in Trier, wandering through the medieval streets, and checking out the annual Christmas market, which was set against the backdrop of the stunning Trier Cathedral. The crisp winter air and the smell of roasting chestnuts filled the atmosphere as we sipped warm Glühwein, chatting and laughing for hours. One of the things I'll always remember about Julie was her hilarious attempts to pick up English. She was constantly asking me about new words, and some of her interpretations had me in stitches. She was especially curious about my frequent use of the word turd, which I often used to describe certain boys we knew. While turd typically refers to excrement, I used it to mean someone obnoxious or contemptible. Julie, ever the eager learner, didn't fully understand at first. After a few explanations, she finally got it. Moments like that, her genuine curiosity and willingness to laugh at herself, made spending time with her so enjoyable. Then there was the Christmas ornament incident. One day, Julie referred to the ornaments as kinky, and I nearly lost it. I think she meant to say shiny, but kinky also means twisted or curly, so it wasn't too far off. We still bring it up now and then, and it always makes us laugh. It was the little things like that, her easygoing attitude, which made Julie such a great person to be around. She was never judgmental, but at the same time, she was very strong in her own beliefs. Even when I came up with some ridiculous idea, she wouldn't criticize me, though she might opt out of joining. Eventually, Julie moved to Texas, where she lived for a while before settling down in South Carolina with her daughter, who's almost about Michael's age. I had the chance to visit her once when all of our kids were still young, and she made us German pancakes, something Mackenzie still raves about, saying they were the best pancakes she's ever had. Julie was a wonderful mother, and it was clear how much she loved her daughter as she watched her run around with all the energy of a typical child. As for Lucky, well, let's just say he didn't end up as lucky as he thought. Julie eventually realized she deserved more than he could offer and made the decision to move on. I couldn't agree with her more. Ransdorf, like Metterich or Binsfield, was in the country and quiet. There was a small park near my apartment, and sometimes I would take the bunnies and let them play in the grass. On one occasion, I let Tony stay in the apartment overnight while I was staying with a girlfriend, Renee, helping with her 2 kids, Adara and Caleb. Almost all of our boys, except Tony and Scott, had been deployed to Qatar for several months. When I came back in the morning, I was livid. Tony, or someone there with him, had thought it would be hilarious to throw raw eggs at my bunnies in the kitchen. There were broken shells and sticky mess everywhere, and my poor bunnies were frazzled. Needless to say, Tony was never left alone in my apartment again. I don't believe that our friends were bad. Throwing out cigarette butts into the street, being loud, traumatizing bunnies, those were just dumb, obnoxious young adult things that we did. Thus, my frequent use of the expression turd. We were out on our own, mostly for the first time, and we were in a country that was similar but very different from our own. I understand why the locals didn't like the American males, though. Some of the ones I knew weren't very respectful of the German daughters. I understand why the locals thought we were insufferable and that we had no regard for anything that was not our private property, because most of us were and didn't. I do wish that I could find Gisela and apologize. I would tell her that I'm genuinely sorry for being so disrespectful and for not asking what I should have been doing instead of acting like my way was the only true and correct way of doing things. Gisela was beyond patient with me. When I prepared to leave the apartment, she conducted the final walkthrough. I was 8 months pregnant. She got down on her hands and knees to show me how I should have been scrubbing the floors to get them cleaner. I looked at her like she was crazy and said, "I'm 8 months pregnant." She was probably ready to strangle me. I don't know that I would falter for that. In the end, I enjoyed Gransdorf. I made so many wonderful and sometimes scary memories there. While I was 8 months pregnant, I had a close call with a near-miss car crash. I was trying to maneuver my vehicle from the top of this snowy, icy hill to the bottom where my apartment stood, and my tires didn't want to cooperate. I was okay until I reached Jackson's apartment. My car just basically slipped and slid to it, and I managed to whip it into the large parking area. After I was safely in place and not an additional part of the building on the way down, I proceeded to take my large, protruding, pregnant belly and stomp and scream all the way to my apartment, which was approximately 10 feet away from Jackson's, about how much I hated Germany. I didn't hate Germany. I never could. I was just scared. Months before that, I remember upon returning from a trip back to the States that ended in my marriage to Jackson, we were driving up the road towards the same top of that same hill, and I asked him to pull over as I felt nauseous. We went straight to the store, and I picked up a pregnancy test. Later that day, I came out of the bathroom of my small apartment, and I said, "Houston, we have a problem." It was history after that. No more parties, well, none that I partook of, and no more smoking in my apartment. I became a different person, protective of the life that was growing within me, protective of my friends, and ready to help them out when they needed it. I became the official designated driver and picked up many of them after long nights at the clubs and bars that I used to visit. I even braved a few travel trips to nearby places on my own when my friends and Jackson were too hungover to go with me. I remember quietly walking through a castle somewhere nearby, just taking in all the beauty and history. The impending arrival of my daughter gave me purpose and direction, and a new thirst for all the historical and cultural sites that I could possibly take in. She put me on the path to becoming a better person, and she wasn't even officially in the world yet. Funny how that works. While Jackson and I were still dating, I brought my sister Katie and brother Tom to Europe in June of 2002. I picked them up from the Frankfurt airport after a very short but tense drive on the Autobahn. I was used to driving on the Autobahn by this point. However, my mother instilled a ceaseless fear of driving deep into my psyche, and to this day, I despise driving. I took Katie and Tom to Manderscheid Castle in Germany, and we walked through the densely forested dirt path that led to the castle ruins. The castle walls still stood, and we were able to get to the top of the Oberburg, the upper castle, so that we could look out to see what the view probably would have looked like all those years ago when it was first built. My brother crawled into the smallest nooks and peeked out through the window, and my sister sat perilously upon the walls lining the very top of the castle, her smile bright as she ventured around this medieval castle, which at that point was already 1,029 years old, if not older. Those are some of my most fond memories of this excursion. On the last weekend in August every year, there's a medieval festival at Manderscheid Castle and the adjacent jousting field, which receives about 15,000 visitors. Jackson, Shannon, and I attended the jousting festival once in August 2001, and we were amazed as we wandered the area and took in the sights. Seeing people dressed as if we were in medieval times was magical, and after we went there, I found a love for any event that would lead to needing to play dress up. This is a destination that holds a special place in my heart. Katie and Tom hung out at mine and also Jackson's apartment, and they were introduced to our friends. My girlfriend, Bettina, took a liking to my brother, who was only about 16 during the trip, and she sat next to him, teasing him almost the entire time. Bettina was a strange girl who had a punk, goth vibe, and after a while, we started to get annoyed with her because she always seemed to be mooching off of everyone for rides or cigarettes. Bettina wasn't a bad person. She lived in Trier, and her house was nice. Her bedroom was in the basement or the lower level of the house, and she had a sauna in it. I think maybe she just didn't have a lot of disposable income to pay for rides out to see us, and the only way she could was by asking us to pick her up. I remember going to her house once, and she made me fizzy water with some sort of sparkling water device in her kitchen. I thought that was pretty fancy. At one point, she invited me to go pick grapes with her in the countryside, which would be used to make glühwein, and I turned her down. I kick myself for not going with her now that I'm older. Anyway, back to her attempt to seduce my little brother. Bettina sat extremely close to my brother, who was now trying out his blue hair, and she laughed lightly and threw her long, straight, honey brown hair over her shoulder. She narrowed her eyes and spoke low enough to where I had no idea what she was saying. I imagine her as a seductive vampire from movies that I've always been fond of. About 5'7", richly endowed with a curvaceous physique, long legs and creamy soft skin. She kept her bangs cut straight across her forehead, just at eye level, and she never wore much makeup. Just enough, I think, to accentuate her almond-shaped eyes and full mouth. I won a photography contest on the base of a photo I took of her hair entwined in the black chains that lay across the entrance to a grave marker. It honestly wouldn't have shocked me if she pulled him closer and sunk a pair of pearly fangs into his neck while they sat on the cold sidewalk, running along Jackson's apartment. I don't think my brother would have objected. We brought Bettina with us when we all went to Luxembourg, one of my favorite places to go as it was close and easy to drive in. Jackson, Lucky, my brother and my sister, and Bettina and I roamed the old stone fortifications of the city and felt like we were part of some fantasy that brought us back in time. A lot of the structures were intact to the point that you could wander the long corridors and even sit atop the black cast iron cannon that sat at the end of one of them. I doubt the cannon was that old, however, we probably shouldn't have sat on it. We strolled across the stone bridge and peered out onto the confluence of the Alzette and Petrus rivers and the luxurious park that flanked each side. How many eyes have viewed the splendor of something so completely simple and natural and felt overcome by the fact that they were able to do so? I tried to capture the moment in photos, and I take them out now and again to remember, but it never seems to compare to standing on that bridge. Boots absorbing the impact of every step, the breeze tossing my hair and the sun kissing my skin. The stone stairs wound down, and sometimes the entire wall was covered in lush foliage and hunter green moss as we descended to the park below. The small tassels on Bettina's black shawl bounced with each step we took, and when I asked her to pose, she whirled it around, flashing her beautifully shaped teeth as she shot me pointed glances that only the camera could capture. We could have wandered that area for hours, enjoying the carefully manicured rose bushes in front of most of the houses and listening to the river flow past us in the heart of the park. But we had more adventures to take part in, and Luxembourg finally had to be put into our memory bank so that we could move on. The nice thing about having a friend from Trier, Germany, was the fact that she knew places to go that someone like me, pre-Google, never would have. Bettina brought all of us, my siblings and I, to the Trier Imperial Baths in Trier, and we wandered around the 4th century AD foundations. I say she brought us, however, I don't believe she had a car, so I drove while she led the way. It was a fair exchange, and she was not a hard person to get along with. Bettina and I also traveled to Frankenstein's castle, Burg Frankenstein, in Germany for Halloween 2002. Burg Frankenstein was a hilltop castle in the Odenwald, overlooking the city of Darmstadt. It is thought that this castle may have been an inspiration for when Mary Shelley wrote her novel Frankenstein in 1818. I have a few photos of us parading around with a fake Frankenstein while he held a severed leg, also fake. Looking back, I'm reminded of a scene in the 2005 movie Hostel, where the local townspeople celebrated some festival and the tourists were chosen to become part of a scheme to allow wealthy people to slaughter them in some pretty gruesome ways. Luckily for us, we weren't slaughtered, but we did have a great time. This was an excursion my siblings didn't go on. They were already gone, but I felt it was worth mentioning. I don't remember much about our trip to Cockham Castle, except for some reason the town had a statue of a Smurf that we, of course, had my brother pose next to with his blue hair. On this trip, only my siblings and I went, and we took the typical tour of the castle. I had already been there once before with some friends, and I ended up going back again to celebrate a local festival there with Jackson and our friends Shannon and Tony. The festival really involved little historical touring and more drinking and roaming the streets with all the other locals and tourists. I remember the boys rode a theme park ride that shot them up into the air, and they were laughing for hours, reenacting their facial contortions afterwards. This was one of the 2 castles my siblings were able to go to, and it was quite beautiful. The ruins of the Oberburg Manderscheid held a pretty stark comparison to the well-maintained rooms and grounds of Cockham, and I was glad that they were able to see them both. Previously, I had gone on a Moselle River tour with friends, and you were able to get a different view than what I had from the actual castle, and that of attending the festival in the town below the castle. I liked the ability to see it from alternative perspectives. Our last excursion, before I had to send them back to Michigan, was to Paris. We drove to Trier and parked my car, where we then boarded the train to Paris. The train ride was pretty uneventful. However, the time spent in Paris was a whirlwind of excitement and strange occurrences. Our hotel was very small. We all shared the same queen-size bed, and I slept in the middle out of courtesy to try to make the trip more enjoyable. When we arrived, it was late and nothing was open, so we scavenged the hotel refrigerator and drank the orange soda to try to keep our blood sugar from plummeting. In the morning, we had croissants, and the hotel employee, possibly the owner, became very upset with us when my brother tried to take what they considered an extra croissant. They thought there were only 2 of us staying in the hotel, and therefore only 2 should have partaken of 1 croissant each. It was hard to rewire our American brains when it came to food. We weren't raised with an understanding of what an actual portion was. We just ate what we were given in the portion size it was given, which truly was at least twice the size of any meal I've had in France. We didn't realize that we looked like gluttonous swine to the hotel employee and probably everyone else in the breakfast room. And maybe our being oblivious was a good thing, because by that time, my brother had devoured the buttery pastry. We basically just laughed it off. I apologized and went off on our way to see the sights. Our first stop was the Louvre. I had been to this museum before, and I knew how important it was for them to see it for themselves. We walked quickly while still allowing ourselves time to look at most of the collections. And once we felt we had spent enough time there, we headed to the underground metro to continue exploring. My sister Katie has never liked crowds or the feeling of being tightly pressed against groups of unknown people, and the metro was exactly that. At one point, a French woman started shouting what I believed to have been religious rhetoric, and my sister casually looked at me as if she was going to try to exit the metro while it was still moving. To this day, I have a hard time bottling up the laughter from the look on her face. We became adept at using the metro, and we went all over the city, taking in the sights, and I'm sure eating at some point. Oddly enough, I don't recall much about the food. On our last day, we checked out of the hotel, and with rolling luggage in tow, we went to see the catacombs. We were surprised they allowed us to roll our luggage through the underbelly of Paris, which was lined with the remains of over 6 million Parisians. On the tour, I thought we were told they had died of leprosy. However, it appears from the historical record that this was not the only cause of death for those found in the catacombs. Leprosy was noted to be endemic during the 15th century after further research, which leads me to believe I just misunderstood. The catacombs of Paris are underground ossuaries in Paris, France, that form a small part of a tunnel network extending south from the Barrière d'Enfer Gate of Hell, former city gate. This ossuary was created as part of the effort to eliminate the city's overflowing cemeteries. Preparation work began in 1774 after a series of basement wall collapses around the Holy Innocent Cemetery added a sense of urgency to the cemetery eliminating measure. And from 1788, nightly processions of covered wagons transferred remains from most of Paris's cemeteries to a mine shaft open near the Rue de la Tombe Issue. As we bumped our luggage across the earthen floor, I felt a drop of moisture fall from the ceiling above onto my forehead. I proceeded to irrationally bounce all over like I was some subterranean insect, positive that I would now be joining the ranks of the diseased dead surrounding me within seconds. 1, 2, 3. I'm still me. Katie and Tom tried their hardest to maintain their composure and not laugh to the point of alerting the tour guides. However, now they were watching us and noticed that my video camera appeared to be on. First, they spoke in French and then broken English, telling me that recording was not allowed in the area. I played the dumb American tourist and showed them my camera and told them the light was red when the camera was off. I lied. To this day, I can't find the footage of our ascent into the pits of Paris. However, it is still very well etched into my mind, like I was just down there yesterday, and to my delight, I don't have leprosy. We dragged our dusty bags up the steps and back out into the streets of Paris and headed to the train. We were sad to have to go, but none of us wanted to have to figure out what to do if we missed our departure. Once we were on the train, everything was set, and all we had to do was wait to get to the station. Until I realized the problem. My car was parked in Trier, and the train was going to Bitburg. I called Jackson, still in boyfriend status, and he was unable to move the car back to Bitburg as he was currently entertaining friends. And by that, I mean that they were all drinking and no one could drive. Just so you understand, this was a typical weekend thing for our group in Germany. And if I wasn't with my brother and sister, I probably would have been with Jackson. So there's no judgment in how the events occurred. They're just facts. Once we arrived in Trier, we had to take a cab from that train station to the one in Bitburg where my car was parked. This was about a 28-minute drive. Currently, a taxi from Trier, Germany would incur a $7.93 tariff and then $3.54 for each kilometer. I've never been great with math, but right now at that rate, you're looking at approximately $113. Needless to say, I do remember watching the taxi meter and checking to see how much money I had. Finally, I had to stop the taxi driver and tell him he had to let us out because I was out of cash. He pulled over and we removed our stuff in the middle of a densely forested paved road. It was the dead of night and each side of the street was lined with deciduous trees that formed a thick canopy, blocking out much of the natural light we would have been getting from the moon. We started to walk. As we trudged down towards the train station parking lot, it got darker and darker, and all of the night sounds were amplified around us. My sister reminded me how much she hated being in the woods, especially at night, and I, of course, found the whole thing to be hilarious. So I began goading her. I started concocting stories of all the wild animals that could be prowling the hidden spaces near our path, and she hissed at me to shut my mouth if I wanted to keep living. We walked for approximately 15 minutes like this until we rounded the corner to the actual train station parking lot. This area was even more forested, and I broke out into a run, yelling the whole way to the car. When I got there, I fell over laughing hysterically, and my siblings threw their belongings in my car and locked the doors behind them. I had already gotten in, so they didn't get a chance to lock me out, although I'm sure they regretted that. That, my friends, is a perfect ending to a fast-paced, whirlwind European adventure, provided to my brother and sister compliments of myself. Thank you very much. But if you don't want to take my word for it, take it straight from my sister Katie's mouth in a synopsis she authored for a photo album my sister Becky put together for me. It goes like this. Paris in a day. Katie and Tom visited Jen in Germany in June 2002. And among the many things Jen had planned was to take them to see Paris. She knew when they were going to leave, how they were going to get there, where they were going to stay, and what they were going to see. Well, things don't always go as planned. We missed the train and arrived in Paris about 5 hours later than planned, tired and cranky. After checking into the hotel room, we took a boat ride, and then went to the top of the Eiffel Tower. We had planned on eating there, but by the time we were ready, the kitchen was closed. There weren't any restaurants near the hotel that were open when we returned. The next morning, we went downstairs for the complimentary continental breakfast, aka croissants and coffee. And we were hassled upon our return to the room because there were 3 of us. We paid for 3 people to stay in the room. On the metro, we endured numerous dirty looks, severe body odor, and a woman yelling something French while getting lost a few times. We walked for hours trying to find souvenir shops, the Louvre, Notre Dame, and the catacombs. The only people who spoke English were the other lost American tourists. At the Louvre, we got to the top floor before we were told that Jen would have to go back to the first floor to check the luggage. We stopped to eat at a small bistro and then made our way to the catacombs. Toting the luggage was no easy chore since the floor was stone and the stairs were narrow. Jen was taking video, even though cameras and camcorders were not to be used, and while having leprosy drop on her from above. At the end of the tour, a French guy decided to flash a picture, and the employees took off after Jen. After being accused of stealing bones, she was allowed to leave with her camera and luggage. We made it to the train station and luckily found the right train, which was guesswork since, again, nobody spoke English. When we arrived late at the first train station the day before, Jen called Jackson and had him move the car to another train station, thinking we could always just take another train to that station. However, by the time we arrived back in Trier, the last train had already run. Jen had to argue in German with the non-English speaking cab driver when he tried to tell us that we wanted to go to the Air Force Base rather than the train station. Finally, as we watched the meter run dangerously close to the last bit of money we had on us, we had him stop ahead of the station so that we could walk the rest of the way to the car. At this point, our feet were about to fall off, we were tired, we were cranky. Jen was upset because so much had gone wrong, and we were now walking along a dark, winding road with nothing around us except forests. Of course, some of our favorite memories of our time in Europe was the trip to Paris. It was an experience we will never forget. Katie Huffman, June 2002. Funny how time fogs the memory, and events change in my mind. Our stories weren't vastly different, but I guess time has made me remember how much fun we had as opposed to how insanely let down I must have felt at the time. Thinking that I had ruined their one chance to explore Paris had, I'm sure, put me into one of my sour moods. I can't even recall after reading my sister's synopsis of what occurred when we got lost so many times, or the fact that we even went to the top of the Eiffel Tower. This is interesting since I've been there twice, once with them, and before that I had gone with Jackson. And now, due to security concerns related to terrorists, you can't even go to the top anymore. I'm glad we were able to do it, and that I have photos to help me remember. To be honest, Europe opened my naive eyes even wider than they already were from the other bases I was stationed at. I learned so many things that most people would have found to be common sense, like don't ever sit next to toilets on a bus tour unless you want to be stuck smelling urine the entire trip back. I learned this on the ITT trip to Venice, Verona, and Florence with Lucas in 2001. You can keep that tip for future reference. Or how important it is to have people you trust with you when you decide to go out drinking in areas you're unfamiliar with. I felt pretty needed holding Nancy's hair back when she puked outside the pub in Speicher, Germany. I mean, seriously, who wants to puke in their hair? How about the fact that Americans have very little capacity for what an actual portion size is? Or at least this American didn't. So you might want to bring snacks with you on trips, just in case that tiny little steak in France tasted amazingly, by the way. Even if Jackson and I didn't realize it was fish and not beef, bring a translation book. Just didn't cut it in filling your belly. These are all just a few things that I picked up over the years. However, I'm sure I could fill books with the little nuances that I would never have known were even a thing before I set off into the world. So many places bring back endless memories that for the most part send me into a dreamlike state when I sit and let my mind wander back to these days. Strolling through a park in Belgium, which led to capturing complete happiness in a photograph of 6 adolescent girls sitting on a wall, forming a sort of chain, like paper dolls, linked arm in arm. Driving through Verdun, France, in the fall of October 2002 with Scott to come upon an old World War II bunker complete with latrine and metal bunks. The cream-colored stained sheets rotting, but still there covering what was once the resting place for French soldiers. Laughing with Tracy, Scott, and Pat when he scratched his brand new, sleek, black BMW, trying to park upon arriving at what he called Versailles in November 2002. It was Versailles, and he wasn't laughing at first. After he came to terms with the fact that there wasn't much to be done, we went to sleep in our small hotel room and awoke to walk the beautiful halls of the palace, complete with art and the surrounding gardens, all of which dated back to King Louis XIII when he discovered a forest and meadows with plenty of game on his first hunting trip of 24 August 1607. More laughing at Erin when she tried to crack her soft-boiled egg during breakfast in Berlin, and the yolk flew into her bone-straight blonde hair before we left it toward the Berlin Wall, and after, Erin, Obi, Jackson, and I had spent the night cruising the Berlin streets pointing out prostitutes. Not my finest moment, and there was no ill intent. It just wasn't something I had ever seen in Bangor, Michigan. Even then, she managed to look good with her sunglasses perfectly perched on the top of her head. Mine were always lopsided. And of course, visiting the Anne Frank House and the Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, Netherlands with Jackson in May 2003. Yes, we only went to those 2 places while there. Some trips were complements of the U.S. Air Force Geographically Separated Units, GSUs, requiring site visits, mostly for gas mask fit testing, and the rest were thanks to my never-ending wanderlust. All the trips were exciting, and they all gave me a better perspective of the world and the people in that world around me. Speaking of perspective, I have to say I always thought that Jackson saved me from myself in Germany by meeting me and bringing me into his fold. I had been on a self-destructive streak since before I even joined the military, and for some reason, just being around him and his friends changed me. It was like I had become a better person than who I was at the time. We still went crazy and did some pretty dumb things. I had my stripe redlined and lost my line number for staff sergeant, thanks to some of those dumb things, but I started turning myself around. Now you want to know about the stripe, don't you? I was an A1C in the Air Force, and I had just tested for staff sergeant and made it by the skin of my teeth. This may have even been my second time testing. I was also still wrapping up my second divorce and was to the point that I would have to drink NyQuil to fall asleep because my head just wasn't on very straight. However, I wasn't beyond the point of no return. I started seeing a psychologist through Base Mental Health. Thank you, Jeannie, for getting me there to try to work through some of my issues while this was happening. I made the mistake of thinking my military supervisor was my buddy and not my supervisor. Word to the wise, you out there in military land, or just really in general, a supervisor is always a supervisor. They're not your friends. Regardless of whether you're at work or off duty, you cannot forget that they're your supervisor, and therefore you should never treat them as anything but. The first incident occurred after a night of drinking at the base club. We were always drinking, unfortunately. My supervisor was also at the club with some of his tech sergeant friends. Air Force rank in order of increase is A1C, Staff Sergeant, Tech Sergeant, and so on. Me, being an A1C, fully understood the concept of fraternization, having personal relations with someone outranking you, and beyond that, I just never really liked older men. So when my Staff Sergeant supervisor tried to hook me up with his unattractive and quote-unquote old Tech Sergeant friend, over 22 was old at this point, I gave him a big no way and left it at that. After my friends and I left the club, we walked past my supervisor outside. I was holding a beer because in my naive state, I thought everyone could legally drink outside. It was Germany, and babies drank beer. I was probably 21, and I had just gotten my belly button pierced. And my supervisor had told me from day one, call me Ween, short for his last name. Not Staff Sergeant such and such, not Sergeant such and such, just my buddy Ween. So when I saw him after he had just tried to get me to go home with his buddy, I thought we were on the same level. And I showed him my belly ring, just by barely lifting my shirt up. And I asked him if he thought it was cool. I don't remember his immediate response. However, that next duty day, I was sitting front and center of my office commander, signing a form stating that I had been acting inappropriately and that I'd asked my supervisor if I was going to get a good reporting period because my belly ring was so cool. After that, it was all downhill. I was written up for saying the word shit in front of a customer, which was stupid, yes. However, that was commonplace in my office, and no one else was ever written up for that. I was written up for napping in my office. I had a door to my office, and I asked Ween if it was okay to nap during lunch, as I was very tired and, to be honest, depressed. He told me it was okay. He wrote me up, and then wrote me up again for having a bottle of liquid NyQuil in my office refrigerator. No one asked if I was okay. They just wrote me up. The final straw that took my stripe was when I was written up for being AWOL because I could not get the electric locks of my old BMW to open to retrieve my military uniform. I kept my uniform in my car because sometimes I would stay on the base with my friend Shannon, and I didn't want to be late for work by having to drive home to get ready for the day. Instead, I would just run out to the car and get my uniform, get ready in a room, and head the few minutes to my office. I contacted my supervisor that morning and told him that I couldn't get into the vehicle before the duty day started, and he did nothing to help me. He just sauntered down the hall with his dirty ramblings about how his need to defecate was increasing. It's getting ready, Huffman. That was it. I was yet again signing a document stating I was in the wrong and now I was not being promoted to staff sergeant. I know what you're saying. Poor me. And I know that I did a lot of stupid stuff. A good majority of it was alcohol related. However, I also understand how people can be driven to the verge of suicide. And it's like no one around them even sees it coming. You feel like you're clinging to the side of a boat drowning, and everyone's just looking around asking what's for lunch. I tried to set myself up so that I made fewer mistakes. I stayed with a girlfriend on base so I didn't have to worry about my car breaking down and being late to work. You saw how that turned out. I tried to mind my P's and Q's at work, but I was always on edge. I went to a freaking psychiatrist, and yet nothing. It didn't matter. And after all of that, my supervisor got himself a DUI for backing out of his driveway drunk and getting caught. And you know what his punishment was? He had his stripe taken away for a certain amount of time, and then it was given back. Because a DUI is just not as bad as a young airman that needs someone to mentor them and to show them that they care, that someone is there with them through this, and they're not alone. Yeah, I finally found Jackson, but not after my world fell apart. Maybe this is why I fell so hard for him. I know for a fact this is why I did not re-enlist when it came time. Good old Ween left such a bad taste in my mouth for how the hierarchy of the military can work sometimes that I wanted no more of it. Don't get me wrong. Future me saw what the Air Force had done for me as a whole, and honestly, I think they got ripped off. They trained a girl from nowhere with nothing, and they showed her the world. They opened her eyes to things that she never would have known existed, and they put her exactly where she needed to be, to have the children that finally made her who she was supposed to be, to who she could be. I can never repay that. And who cares about Wayne anyway? The whole thing taught me a very important lesson in the end. Not everyone is your advocate. There are people in your life who were put there to teach you some hard lessons, even if it doesn't seem fair. And then some amazing people who would move mountains just to help chisel out that remarkable potential that hides beneath the surface. I'm forever grateful to my friend and my father for setting me on this path. For all of those who lifted me and taught me so much when I felt like I was nothing. For the people that taught me that you have to be there for yourself before you can be there for anyone else. My mom taught me this from day one, but I guess I just needed to hear it more and more from as many people as possible who could pound it in my skull. So now you know the story about how I lost my stride and how it led me to exactly where I needed to be. Where were we? The beginning of my semi-responsible life. I started dating Jackson when my divorce was being finalized, and we decided to get married after about a year or so, when we were both coming up to the end of our term in Spangdahlem Air Base. That's pretty typical for the military. One of the biggest reasons that I saw, at least for young marriages, was that the two little lovebirds didn't want to get separated geographically, and therefore they got married beforehand so the military would be more likely to keep you together. There are a few faults with that logic. First off, if the military wanted you to have a family, they would have issued you one. That being said, you signed up, and they can send you wherever they want. Doesn't matter if you're married or not. Secondly, the average amount of time I've seen people being stationed at the same place is gone from 1 to 8 years. Poor Sergeant Sweetheart at Eglin Air Force Base. A lot of the marriages to avoid separation due to a PCS have not lasted more than 7 years. That would be my own, in case you're wondering. Maybe you should never have gotten married in the first place and saved yourself another divorce. There are probably more reasons why you shouldn't get married after a short period just to avoid PCSing, but I digress. Jackson proposed to me on what I called Spider Island. I think they were little crab spiders, and they were everywhere, somewhere in either Nevada or maybe California. I hate spiders, so the poor guy was trying his hardest to be chivalric. He had even asked my mom and dad for my hand, of which my mom said, "It's your funeral. She's never getting married again." I was dancing all over the place, trying to keep the spiders off my feet, and there he was, kneeling, oblivious to anything other than my response. I, of course, said yes, and we decided to get married shortly thereafter at Lake Tahoe with a strange Native American-ish man and a $500 wedding dress from David's Bridal. It was a whirlwind, but it wasn't weird to me. I've always been impulsive, and this just seemed like it was what I was supposed to be doing. Jackson had gotten back from a tour in Qatar, and I didn't want him to PCS to another base without me. The only choice in my brain was to marry him. We got married near some sort of casino area on a beach, because I remember having our wedding reception afterwards in a restaurant-type area. His family, mom, dad, sister, and brother, attended, as well as my best friend Shannon, who was my maid of honor, and his best friend Vince, his best man. His mom brought a princess cake, Jackson's favorite, to the wedding reception, which seriously was just a table in the restaurant. But I was never one for fancy, and it never crossed my mind that this wasn't good enough. I wasn't a fan of the cake. I guess I don't like marzipan, but it was a very sweet gesture. My family couldn't attend because it was way too short notice. But then again, this was husband number 3, so it wasn't a big deal either way. When we got back to Germany in late July, it was only 2 weeks before the drive up the hill brand store that I made Jackson pull over because I thought I was going to be sick, and then I announced, "Houston, we have a problem." Mackenzie was born about 2 weeks early, and when Jackson's mom found out that we were pregnant, one of the first things she asked me was if I had been pregnant before we had gotten married. To this day, I don't think she believes me. I can't blame her. But facts are facts, and Mackenzie knew when her time was. But then again, it's not time for her story yet. So what's it like being pregnant in Germany, you might ask? People like to smoke in Germany, and most of our life together revolved around drinking, partying, and being where people were smoking. Our lives completely changed when I found out I was pregnant. I wouldn't let anyone smoke in the house anymore. Jackson started working on quitting smoking, and he never smoked around me again. We couldn't go out to eat at some of our favorite places because no one had started enforcing the whole non-smoking sections. Our friends stopped coming over as much because we probably weren't as much fun, and that led me to start hanging out with my office secretary, Dawn, because she was there with her family, and they liked to go on trips. Dawn and I went on 2 trips that I will never forget. Both were with her family, and both were information tickets and tours, ITT, trips, on a tour bus run by the Air Force. The first trip was with her daughter Kimberly and her son Derek in February 2003, which would have put me in a pre-pregnant status. We went to London, England, and it was amazing. We used the metro and walked around eating at the Hard Rock Cafe. Why we ate here and not an actual local place, I don't know, but it was still wonderful. I laugh every time I look at the photo of young Kimberly and me posing next to a mural of an attractive and fit bald man with small white cups lining his head and down his bronzed bare spine. There was anti-war graffiti spray painted on the concrete walls, and in the middle of the streets, no war. And there were naked women posters in the red telephone boxes. I covered Derek's eyes like any good mom or older sister would do. We saw Big Ben, and we went to a torture museum. Maybe the Museum of Torture? And we had the most hilarious interaction with a very strange man while we waited in line for the museum. Dawn, her children, and I were waiting to go into the museum. It was a pretty long line, and a funny thin man, probably in his 20s, came bouncing up to us, looked us dead in the eye, and said very matter-of-factly, "I've got a green, Squeaky," emphasizing on the green. To this day, I get a kick out of it, and I don't know that I'll ever understand what that means. Our last trip together was to Auschwitz, Poland in November 2003. I believe her husband and son went with us on this trip, and our daughter stayed with a friend back at Spangdahlem. This trip was the polar opposite of the trip to London, England. By this time, I was about 6 months pregnant, and the entire feeling was foreboding and sorrowful. We took the ITT bus again, and at the checkpoint to enter Poland, everything just kind of changed to something of an old war movie. The guards were very serious, and we all just waited for them to file through the bus to ensure all of our documents were in order. We continued until we arrived at Auschwitz II, Birkenau, where we disembarked, and the tour guide walked us to a set of barracks. Inside were wooden bunks stacked, 3 to 4 bunks high. It was a cold November, and I remember just thinking about how hard the bunks looked and how dirty everything was. I couldn't imagine ever being forced to live in conditions such as these, and my heart just started to hurt for all the people that not only lived, but died at this very location. Afterwards, we were allowed to roam about for a bit. Then we got back on the bus, and we were taken to Auschwitz I. We walked through those notorious Arbeit frei gates, as the tour guide described what that walk would have been like for so many who never left. The air around me was impenetrable, and I felt like I had just stepped back into another time. Each step took me closer to so many horrors that I could never fully comprehend, and yet I felt the desire to know more. We stood in front of the death wall where the condemned were led before execution, and we were allowed to touch the jagged bullet holes etched so many years ago that represented a life just in themselves. We walked through the halls of some of the old barracks, which contained piles of shoes, hair, glasses, and suitcases, all remnants of the people that were subjected to this horror. There were printouts of some of the prisoners along the halls, and as I walked past them, I stared into their forlorn faces, asking myself, who were you? Why would something so terrible be allowed to happen to such a defenseless and innocent person? How could this even be? The sorrow of what this place was, and those people who suffered, was becoming more and more real to me. Finally, we drifted to the last place that many of the residents of this terrible place would see, the crematorium. One by one, we slowly filed through the solitary, bulky metal door of the concrete structure that was Crematorium 1. The first and largest room was originally designated as a morgue. However, it was adapted as the first provisional gas chamber in 1941, where the SS used Zyklon B to kill thousands of Jews, including prisoners selected in the hospital as unlikely to recover their health quickly. Poles sentenced to death by the German summary court, and several groups of Soviet prisoners of war, POWs. Some of those selected were selected upon arrival. Crematorium 1 was operated from 15 August 1940 until July 1943, and according to calculations by the German authorities, 340 corpses could have been burned every 24 hours after the installation of these 3 furnaces. I stood in the sizable room on the stiff concrete floor, merely inches from other tourists, and the tour guide closed the door to the outside world. He asked that we closed our eyes and imagined just for a minute what those who suffered their last moments in this very room would have felt. My hands automatically gravitated towards my increasingly growing belly, and I felt an immeasurable amount of grief. It wouldn't have mattered to the commandant of this extermination camp that I was pregnant. No one would have felt remorse about sending me and my unborn child to die for something so completely meaningless. I would have no means of escape as the crowd around me would have pressed and crushed together in fear. human survival instincts kicking into full gear. A tear sank down my cheek as these thoughts assaulted my very being and reminded me just how vicious humans can be. The tour guide then led us into the furnace room to see the final phase of this horrifying process. Brick furnaces are efficient in their task, blackened by usage and stained with the lives of so many blameless men, women, and children. All for what? Because a fanatical tyrant was allowed to fan the flames of hate? So many guiltless people died because one man allowed his henchmen to do these depraved things that would have stopped most people in their tracks. Instead, the tracks of the innocent stopped here, in this cold, dank room of fire and desolation. I peered into the dark abyss of the furnace, now adorned with 3 red candles and flowers at its very mouth. When I returned from this trip, I was a different person. I had never seen the true extent of how utterly brutal humans could be to each other, and I began reading anything I could on the events of the Holocaust and was beyond surprised to find out that some people deny it even occurred. Bury your head in the sand as much as you like. It doesn't wash away the pain of history. Jackson and I took a trip to Hinzert concentration camp in Germany out of curiosity before I ever went to Auschwitz. This was in August 2002. The area was more of an open field with stone remembrance monuments. However, what struck me the most was the proximity to the nearest town. You would have been able to hear the cries and to smell the bodies burning. The military men would have come to that town for provision. War is heartless, I understand, and I'm sure that out of fear, the residents of that town stayed quiet. Maybe they acted like they had no idea what was happening. But they knew. Deep down, they knew. I would say that I could only hope something this atrocious could never happen again, considering our foresight. But we know that it's happening across the world. After World War II, genocides were spanning the globe. In a 2017 Business Insider report, there were 5 continuing genocides still occurring. The Rohingya in Myanmar, Nuer and other ethnic groups in South Sudan, Christians and Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, Christians and Muslims in the Central African Republic, and Darfuris in Sudan. These people don't differentiate between young or old, man or woman. They just kill indiscriminately based on whatever belief they harbor. When I joined the Air Force, it wasn't to serve my country or to fight. I joined for college and to travel. I had no idea of just what we fight for, no idea of the evil that exists in the world. Hate does nothing but create more hate. And for what? Something inside me began to form. A love for others just because they existed. I was always protective of those who seemed like they needed protecting. Remember the pregnant girl at Rock 'em Ring? But now I felt like I needed to start thinking about how all my actions created the world around me and the world for others that I will never know. I can make that world better, or I can help burn it down. It's my choice.